All right, so we're now 2 minutes past the hour, so we can get started here. Hello, everyone. I'm Simona Zar, Director of Industry Affairs and Public Policy at Supply Chain Canada. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, A to Z of ABC Analysis, in partnership with Slimstock Canada. We're joined today by Danny Bloom, Senior Consultant at Slimstock. As a supply chain expert and senior consultant at Slimstock, Danny Bloom has over 10 years of experience implementing supply chain solutions. He has helped over 30 companies optimize their supply chains in his career while keeping a delicate balance between people, processes, and results. Before I hand it over to Danny, I'd just like to remind everyone that we are recording this webinar. If you'd like a copy, please get in touch with me after this webinar. If you do have a question for Danny, make sure to type it in the chat or the Q&A pod, and we'll go through as many of the questions as we can at the end. For those with the SCMP, just note that this webinar is 2 CPD points, and I will kindly ask that you take the time to enter your activity in the member portal. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Danny.
All right, thanks, Simona. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar about basically ABC analysis. We will be talking about the, so we call it the A to Z of ABC analysis. Meaning we're not discussing how to make an ABC. I think everyone's probably very well aware with the concept, but we're going to talk about how to use it and what data to use and what are things you're looking out for. So quick agenda. We're trying to keep the the content to a limit of about 45 minutes, and we'll leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end. Feel free to just use the chat to submit them during the session. And we'll return to them at the end. You also have the ability to ask questions, and we can unmute you to do that. So first, a little bit about Slimstock and why we're doing this particular webinar. Then we're going to continue with the basis of any ABC analysis, which is the Pareto analysis, and we're going to spend a lot of time on aligning ABC with your goals and how you can actually achieve aligning an ABC with your company goals or the goals of the actual project that you're undertaking. So to get started, Simona already gave an introduction of me. I'm going to keep this short. So my name is Danny Bloom. I've been with Slimstock for about 7 years now. We're 6 years in Canada. Basically, I help onboarding customers to our cloud-based inventory management or demand and supply planning solution called Slim4. And on top of that, I run our Slimstock Academy, of which this webinar is a part of, where we share our knowledge with partnering with Supply Chain Canada, but also partnering with universities and colleges all across Canada to get the knowledge out and also make sure that a lot of our customers are trained on the topics that our software delivers on. So a little bit about Slimstock. So Slimstock is a global provider of inventory management solutions with local support. Now, what does that mean? Our company was started in 1993, so quite a while ago in the Netherlands. Now, almost 30 years later, we have offices across the globe. We have more than 1,000 customers that use our software for their inventory management, for their supply planning, and for their forecasting. We roughly do 130 to maybe now 150 projects each year. And we prize ourselves on having a 96% customer retention rate. So basically any customer that has joined us since 1993, 96% of them are actually still among our customer base and are running most of the time, the more recent developed software that we actually push out. So we have customers in about 50 countries and offices in 26. You can see a rough map here on the slide deck. Now, what is inventory management from our perspective? And later on, we'll talk a bit more about how that plays into ABC. So We deliver solutions for forecasting, so demand planning, statistical forecasting, machine learning, and we basically tie that into inventory management. So we do supply chain planning, as you can say it, but especially the math behind it. So how much am I shipping from A to B? How much do I need on the shelf? There's a lot of functionality to manage assortments, ABC being one of those very critical and important parts of managing assortments. We deal with promotions management, shelf life management in fresh produce, etc. We have solutions for S&OP, product lifecycle management, multi-location management, and order optimization. So really placing POs, filling containers, that sort of stuff is also an integral part of our product offering. So moving away from Slimstock and going into what ABC is. I think a lot of companies use ABC. I think most people should be aware of the term, and you'll find different variants across different businesses. Some companies might talk about their fast movers and their slow movers. Some others call it ABC. There's other designations, but basically an ABC is a classification of product that indicate a more important product over a less important product. So an important product would be considered an A mover, and an unimportant or not so much important product could be a C mover. And there's different variants. Some companies use A, B, C, D, and E, but basically it all boils down to the same. Now, if we talk a bit more about the background behind ABC, there's several forms of doing an ABC analysis on a product assortment, but I think the most common one is what we call, or the most common input is what we call a Pareto analysis. Some people might know this as the 80-20 rule. It's basically where the 80-20 rule was based on. It's basically a principle introduced by Vilfredo Pareto in the 19th century. He was a 19th century Italian economist who kind of found out that 80% of the Italian wealth could be attributed to 20% of the population. And he found that this rule of thumb was actually applicable to many social and economic events that you analyze. And it might not always be 20-80 or 80-20. Sometimes it's 90-10. There's different ratios. But surprisingly, you'll find that there's a lot of companies where you can actually say that 80% of their sales are done by only 20% of their assortment. And it's still a very common limitation or a common aggregation that we observe in the market. So this is basically where ABC comes from. It's basically a classification of any items that are among those top movers or are further down the chain. So it's often used in business analysis to show really the difference or the disparity between the number of products and the customers that are driving sales. So it's a tool that allows you to bring focus. So if I talk a little bit more about the calculation, and again, I don't want to go into too much depth, but if we make the assumption that we're ranking or scoring SKUs based on their contribution to revenue. So revenue could be one way to do this analysis. In this case, what you would have on the axis that you see here, this would really be the amount of revenue by SKU. So if you know the amount of revenue by SKU, you can order the items based on their revenue. And if you're looking at the items that are on top, so let's say you have a list of items, you have the revenue by SKU, and you sort it for the SKU with the highest revenue to be on top. The second SKU would be the SKU with the second highest revenue, etc. So basically then you could easily say, okay, what are the SKUs that cumulatively do, or the top SKUs that cumulatively do the top 20% or the top 80% of my revenue. And those SKUs could be considered your A mover. So you set a score, you say, okay, what are the SKUs that do 80%? And the top SKUs that do 80% would be considered an A mover. The next 15% would be a B mover, and the last 5% would be a C mover. There's a very common pattern. So you see here that if we have the revenue on this axis on the left, and we have the SKU numbers here, we see that the 80% of revenue mark would be here. So on this side, we have the scale, and we see that these SKUs are the top SKUs that make up that 80%. So the SKUs in this bucket would be considered an A mover. The SKUs in this bucket would be the B movers, and here we have the C class, last but not least. So that's the principle behind ABC classification, or a very common principle. Now, what you have on this this axis here, whether that's turnover or something else, that's up for debate. And I'm going to really talk you through the debate you should be having to get to the right parameter that or the right calculation metric that we're using. So that's really the goal of today's webinar, is to teach you more about the thought process that goes into selecting the right metric to run an ABC on. And there's no right metric, there's a right metric for the goal you're trying to achieve. So that's what I want to have as a takeaway for everyone at the end of the session. So I'm going to take that to the next slide. So why do we want to do an ABC to begin with? What's the driver for doing this for any business? So I think if you're looking at companies nowadays with growing assortments, fragmentation of demand, there's more and more products. If you go in grocery stores, they continuously change their product assortment, and you see more and more products being added. So there's more choice. Now, if we look at the people that have to plan this, obviously there's not always time to focus your attention on every product. So if you're a demand planner, forecaster, or you're a purchaser, or you have any other job that relates to inventory management or supply chain, there's not always time to really focus on every product. So an important result of the ABC is that it allows you to decide where to put your time and efforts towards, because we want to make sure that you plan for your most important items. But that's already assuming that we have a certain goal, and that goal is to actually give planners focus. So this doesn't apply to everything. So anyway, so it's an important tool to gain insight, but it's also it can also be an important tool to optimize, and not only to optimize it, it allows you to have a conversation with other people in the business about a SKU, not even dependent on what you do. So a bit more about the ABC analysis and some of the metrics you can run this on. So if we want to apply focus with that ABC analysis, and we categorize an assortment in A, B, or C, which are, there's different selections. So we already talked about what are the options for, I gave the example earlier with revenue, so which would be considered turnover. So you could do an ABC on turnover. That could be very useful. We could do an ABC on demand, maybe demand in units. But then obviously, if you have a very wide product assortment, different product categories, you'll see some issues with that. So that you can just say, okay, these items are my A movers, if that's going to bring that very cheap maybe nuts and bolts up as my A movers. That might not be where you actually want to spend your time on. Could be on margin to really see the benefits for your company. So what are the money makers? We could be looking at order lines, so picking movements. How often is an item picked? We can talk about on-hand inventory if we want to focus or balance working capitals. And there's probably a lot more different versions or different criteria that you can run an ABC on. Next to that, we have to, of course, make make room for a discussion about the boundaries. I think this is more an art than a science. We're looking at the what are the SKUs that do 70% of your turnover. Depending on your business, it could be 20% of the items, it could be 30%, or maybe it's 10%. And I think setting those boundaries, when I call it an art, that means I think every company should be looking at, okay, what are the amount of items that we can actually handle or deal with in a certain location, and start to play with that threshold so you have an acceptable number of A items. And what is acceptable depends on your goal again. If you're trying to optimize a warehouse layout, or you're trying to optimize planner time, maybe a planner can really only pay attention to 5% of the assortment. So we might need to shove that a threshold lower or higher depending on how many items end up as a result of that. So there's a little bit of playing, and there's really no best practice. Typical is 18-15-5 or 70-20-10, as you see in the sheet here. Those are typical numbers, and ones that typically work out when you're doing your analysis. Now, I think the most important part, if we want to align our ABC with your goals. So we've talked about it a little bit already. So if let's say you want to classify items as A, B, or C, I don't think there's a right or a wrong way of doing it. There's definitely a right or wrong way to do it for achieving a certain goal. So if we assume that maybe you want to optimize your DC, so we're really looking at DC operations. So maybe outside of the scope of supply chain planning, but we want to make sure that we're trying to affect the picking impact. So, if somebody, an order picker, would have to travel to grab A movers at the end of the aisle, then and that A mover moves all the time, and we're using order lines, then obviously they're going to be walking down the aisle up and down quite often, which might not be what you want. So you want to maybe put your A movers in front. So that's when we say, okay, that's what we want to achieve. That tells us something about the criteria we're going to have to use. Now, if you're trying to balance your working capital, so in this case, you really want to identify any expensive items contributing the most to inventory. So we're looking at a form of cost of goods sold, or maybe projected average inventory to run an ABC. And that will give, in that case, the ABC will really work as a means to identify the items where you might need to have process improvements to shorten your lead time, maybe decrease your minimum order quantities. It will allow a different form of focus if you go into that. If you want to increase your customer service, so maybe you want to increase your service level, so you really have to align your ABC criteria with what is the definition of service that we have. Are we looking at the amount of order lines delivered to a customer when they ask for it, or are we talking about units? Do we have any other metrics? So we have to align it in a different way. And if your goal is to really find your money makers, I think that's really beneficial in the world of demand planning. So what are the items as a demand planner that you should actually be on top with considering your forecast? Given that you might have 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, or maybe 1,000,000 SKUs in your assortment, and no demand planner will have the time to look at all of them. So the ABC can be a tool to find the ones that actually bring in the money, and where it's very valuable to spend more time on your forecast, because any increase in forecast accuracy, any increase in better inventory will make a big impact on the bottom line. So that's a bit about the goals, and I selected 4 different goals here. There might be different ones that I overlooked or that you know of. So these are just examples, not a full list. Now, if we relate that to what sort of criteria you might have available, you'll find there's no one size fits all. And I think the beauty is you actually don't have to pick one. When you're doing an ABC analysis, you can run different ones for whatever it is you're trying to achieve. Um, it doesn't always have to be the same across the company. And for example, if you want to optimize your DC, you can really look at picking movements or order lines, outbound order lines. We can maybe weight is an important factor, or maybe the size of a product if you're trying to optimize it. Um, so again, there's not one, and for different subsets or for different product categories, you might be using different criteria. And that's, again, it's important to specify that up front, because running an ABC on one ABC on everything might not always be the best choice. We'll talk more about that later. If you want to balance your working capital, as I previously mentioned, you want to maybe spend your time, maybe you want to classify by cost of goods sold over the last year, or even better, cost of goods sold of your forecast, to account for any product assortment changes or any trending in the market. Maybe we want to do it on projected average stock value if we want to spend our time on finding the products where we want to tweak our inventory parameters so the inventory becomes lower. If we want to increase our customer service, we're definitely typically looking at order lines or units sold, or things like that. And also from there, take the next step to align our ABC with service level targets. So from an inventory management perspective, we want to give the A items maybe a higher service level than we want to give to the B or C items. And again, that also helps with balancing your working capital. So again, there's not one best solution, and you might end up using a combination of the two. If you want to find your money makers, we really have to talk margin or sales price. So what is maybe the revenue that we're making? So we're looking at what are we forecasting in terms of units multiplied by the margin or sales price to get an idea of what items are going to bring in the most money over the next year. And that will allow you to find focus and time, and spend your planner time on those products, or maybe the A items are the ones that you want to expedite through a production process. So it allows a different form of focus, and it has a different goal. So what about using multiple criteria? Sometimes one from the list that I just shown, maybe one is not enough. Sometimes it is. So if we give an example, if you're setting up your warehouse, and you definitely want your fast runners closer to the expedite zone, or have them in the front of your warehouse, or at least close to where the order pickers are working, so they have to travel less distance. So typically we want to look at order lines. So what are the expected amount of order lines, or what were historical amount of order lines that we've been looking at, and we rank our ABC by that, and we move our A movers to the front, then the B movers, and then the C movers, or we put the C movers on top and the A movers at the bottom, depending on the product and the product size and the layout of your warehouse. So for a warehouse project, you might be only looking at one criteria. Now, in demand and supply planning, sometimes it's not enough, because there's items that kind of fit in a small niche, that might be overlooked if you do it only on one criteria. So I think an example from maybe the do-it-yourself business is paint sticks. So if you buy paint at a store, that paint is probably what drives the money. There's definitely a good margin on paint, and that could be considered a very important item. But if we're doing our ABC analysis and our goal setting, and we're looking at margin or revenue, and we end up buying a lot of paint because it drives a lot of money, and we kind of forget about the paint sticks because we give those away for free. So there's no revenue, there's no margin. There might be a negative margin, it will cost you money, but without the paint stick, you cannot actually sell the paint, or You can, but I don't think your customers will be too happy, because it's kind of an expectation, right? So basically, they would become a C mover. So in that case, we say, okay, from a demand and inventory perspective, we have to look at a crossover of the two, of two elements. So basically, let's say we do two analysis. So we do one on turnover or margin, basically anything that would give us a rough idea of the sales impact of the business. And the other one we do on order lines. So how often are they picked, or we do it on units sold or units used, in case they're not sold. And we look at what are the units that we actually that leave our location very often. So this is where you might find the paint sticks. This is where you might find the nuts and bolts to be A items. Whereas on the other hand, you might find the paint as an A item and the nuts and bolts and the paint sticks as C items. So you might find that there's a sort of an inverse result between the two. And if we overlay those two analysis, we get we refer to as it's often referred to as an ABC XYZ analysis to show that there's another layer of depth. We might be calling it a 9-cell ABC, because basically there's 9 possible combinations of criteria. So an item could be an AA mover. So that means there's both a lot of order lines and there's a lot of revenue that it brings in. So that's really, that's the real core of your business. Those are the items that you that really make a difference in your world. So from a demand and supply planning perspective, that's where absolutely nothing can go wrong. So here we really want to start small but significant. Train as you fight, become flawless, have clean and complete master data, and improve your processes and ask the why question very often. Now, if we're looking at some of the fringes, I think from this perspective, one of the more interesting buckets would be the A or the CA movers. So it's a C in terms of sales and an A in terms of order lines. So that means here you'll find very cheap products that don't bring in a lot of money, but they move very, very fast. So in terms of demand and inventory planning, these are the items that we want to have a sort of a set and forget approach. That's for two reasons. They don't bring in any money. So we don't want to be looking at the forecast too closely. It's okay if we over forecast. They don't cost a lot anyway. They actually don't impact your inventory value too much. But they sell and they move very fast. So any out of stock, and you probably, to say this not so politically correct, but you'll look like a moron if you run out of nuts and bolts. If you go to a Home Depot and they don't have nuts and bolts that you need, you're probably thinking, why are these guys in business? Whereas if they don't have a typical air conditioner or a specific model of a toilet, you'd probably be fine with that, and you can wait a couple of days. So we really want to increase and get more buffer and just make sure you don't spend too much physical time on, because every time a planner has to look at this and you don't have it automated and there's no automation, you lose your margin and you lose precious time that could be spent on the items that are an A in the sales bucket. So on the other hand, we have the A items that are bringing in a lot of revenue but don't move very fast. So those could be very expensive items where you sell very little of. And there, if we're looking at it in terms of focus, that's where demand planners, when you forecast 1 a month or 2 a month, that makes a big difference in your inventory value and your because they're probably very expensive items. So you have a different type of strategy, a different type of supply chain strategy in that focus area. And so one of these 9 cells will really help you to know where you should focus your time versus where you should focus your automation and sort of never out of stock efforts as automatically as possible. So this will help you drive that strategy. Then I think there's quite a few other important focus areas that we see. It's easy to run an ABC. It's more difficult to run an ABC on part of the assortment that really matters. So if you're implementing an ABC, how do you actually set that up? Do you run an ABC within a location? Um, if you're trying to optimize the service from a DC or a branch or a store, it might be that that store has different A movers or C movers than another store has that might be in a different geographic area and has different types of demand. So if you run an aggregated analysis of the two stores together, you might get results that don't really fit with the perceptions that the people in that local or in that location have of how the market behaves, and there might be a big disconnect. We've seen examples of customers that would have started a strategy where they would look at it from a global perspective, and they would be storing products that or stocking products that were really catering towards a certain country or a certain market in different countries, because that market where it was popular was just much bigger. So it would be considered an A mover across the globe, but really it was only selling in one market, and that's where you'll see disconnects from the way the world really works. So we need to apply focus and run an ABC within a location. And it could be an aggregated geographical location because they might be very similar, but that might actually be at branch level. Something you see in the automotive industry is that there's could be different sort of car parts that sell in different branches, even if those branches are in the same city, because by neighborhood there might be different car brands driving. So there's a different sort of market share for the products that they sell. And if they would run a citywide or a geographical area-wide one, that that ABC wouldn't really reflect the on the floor dynamics. Maybe we want to focus by product group. I think another one is, like we talked about the nuts and bolts earlier. If you look at the sales numbers of nuts and bolts versus air conditioners, the air conditioners are probably going to be on top. And if you're running an ABC, there might be, maybe you want to, if your goal is to really identify the top movers within a certain product group, so maybe you really you want to know what your top products are, but you also want to you also really want to know what you also know that you have to offer certain product groups. So you cannot get, you can't really cut off the nuts and bolts, but maybe you can actually get rid of the C movers of the nuts and bolts, or the C movers in the air conditioner group. So again, you might be looking at a focus per product group if your goal is to do an assortment analysis and really talk about phase out or phase in of products, etc. That also ties into a life cycle stage. If you're for example, if you're trying to do inventory management, we obviously don't want to take our discontinued items into that analysis, because we know we're not going to stock for those anymore. So we have to filter that out. Our new products, as they haven't started selling yet, or they just started selling, you might actually have a different strategy for them. So if your goal is to give the most important items a high service level and drive a lot of inventory so you can sell more, you might want to exclude your new items from there, because otherwise they might be part of that C moving class. And that might be, that might lead to your company applying the wrong strategy for those products. So it all comes down to business rules. What's the strategy we're going to use? And typically for new items, you want to have a different strategy than for the items that you've been selling for a long time and you actually know how they're going to perform. Another thing is to make sure you differentiate by price range. That could be important. It's not important if you're doing your warehouse optimization, obviously. But it could be important when you're doing your inventory strategy. So setting service levels, looking at how often you should order, looking at the lead times, price ranges could be important to help you focus on certain items. You don't want, again, also comes down to product group. You don't want your cheap products really mixed with your expensive products. So that could be one of those angles, or one of the cutoff points where we only include items that are over $100, or we're including only items that are below a certain threshold. So we know how to reach our goal in this section. So you could be making different ABC classifications per focus area. So you'd be basically saying, okay, we have product group air conditioners, we would have product group nuts and bolts, and we would do an ABC analysis within that group. So we compare it to the total sales of that particular group. And then you get a different sort of analysis than if you look at your assortment as one unit. And again, this really depends on what you're trying to achieve. So this really works for making assortment cuts. Cutting out the C movers, that's fine, and you might not care about the localization, but you care about what are the important products within one of our product group offerings. So some other, I think there's some other differentiators when you include or exclude items from your analysis. So definitely we want to differentiate on product group. In some cases, we might want to look at it by warehouse or location or geographical region, maybe by shops. Maybe there's you have big shops and small shops, and you could run different sort of analysis based on the characteristics of the location. Maybe you want to actually do an ABC of your suppliers. So you want to find out what your top suppliers are. And if you start to combine these different analytics, so you have an item that's considered a C mover that you only sell to your C customers, and it comes from a C supplier. Is that really something you want to carry? So you have a supplier where you rarely buy anything off, and you buy that product that only goes to a customer that only buys that one product. So it's a C customer. It's not really important. And it also doesn't bring in any money or doesn't do any order lines. So that, makes it a very good candidate to be cut off. Whereas if it's coming from an A supplier, you might easily get it within, their range of minimums and constraints. And it's easy to add it. If it goes to an A customer, it could be critical for business revenue, because maybe that customer, if you stop carrying that product, it might not be it might not go over well, and it might take their entire business elsewhere. So those are considerations you have to make and find the right balance of criteria, combining them together to get a much deeper analysis. What you should also consider in any analysis is things like expiration dates. If we're trying to run an ABC analysis on items that have strong expiration dates, and we have those included in our analysis, and we use that analysis to define a supply chain strategy that might go wrong for anything that has expiration dates. So I think as an example, if you have some fresh produce that sells very little, and you decide that, it might be a C mover, and you decide for your C movers, you're going to order them only monthly, then obviously the items with an expiration date could be in danger, and you'd be buying too much. So really use those elements to make exclusions or get rid of items in your analysis when you're using it to develop supply chain strategies. Stocking policies. Are you looking at ABC items as, the assortment that's stocked in a location versus non-stocked, or a buy to order versus a buy to stock? When you're talking service levels or achieving a certain level of service, you might only be talking about the part of the assortment that's considered a stocked assortment. You might want to take into account demand variation, or look at seasonality. If we're looking at a forecast or an A mover, and it's our goal to optimize replenishment or order cycles, an item could be a seasonal item and sell a lot in summer and be an A mover there, but then in the winter you would consider it a C mover. So if you take that seasonality and demand variation over the year into account, you can make better decisions throughout the year. And it's okay if an item drops from A to C in a certain season and kind of drops off your radar as that happens. And it could be perfectly fine to use that in your analysis. We have our product lifecycle status. Maybe, as I said, we don't want to include new products typically. Maybe we do want to do it for a warehouse optimization, but we don't want to do it for making the analysis which items to phase out. Because if you're going to take your new items in there, then obviously they haven't sold yet. So we're, we could end up making decision to phase them out right away. So take that into account, and we should be looking at pricing and volume. So yeah, to really summarize, I think it's important to start with your goals. Making an ABC is relatively easy. You can do it in Excel. You can use other tools. It's a native part of our software to run these type of analytics. I think the difficulty is to find the different sorts of data and finding the right criteria. And if you start by aligning your goals to how you do that ABC analysis, you should be in a much better position to actually drive value in for your company. So that's the workshop we had for you. It's the webinar. We now have about 15 minutes for questions from the crowd. I see there's a bunch coming in already. I see a question from Emily. Are you able to send us the slide deck? Yes, we'll share the slide deck with the participants afterwards. So they're probably going to be shared by Simona to everyone that has registered. So yes.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, now's your chance. Now's your moment. Oh, I see here's a question, Danny, in the chat.
Yeah, let me read that out. It's a question from, I see Ray. So from a DC perspective, if we're doing an ABC analysis using the order lines for items over a historical time range, from your experience, how would that approach analyzing items that experience stockouts or back orders over the time range? Yeah, stockouts are, of course, always a concern. So obviously, if you have lots of stockouts, some of your historical data might be compromised. And in that case, you might actually switch to maybe making a forecast of the number of order lines. So using a forecast always has the advantage that a forecast is not only historical data, it also includes future data that's added by the demand planning team or someone else, and could give you a better idea of what the actual number of order lines are going to be. Now, I think from a warehouse perspective, what you should also take into account is not to rerun it too often. You don't want to redesign or put everything somewhere else every month, because then you're defeating the purpose, because the exercise of redoing your warehouse layout or your warehouse stock positions could be quite impactful. So you might want to keep that, as at a higher interval than you might want to do it for demand planning or assortment cuts, which you might run on a monthly basis. All right, do we have any other questions?
Don't see any questions in the chat or the Q&A pod, but if you do have a question for Danny, just type it out. It's a jam-packed webinar here. Oh, there's a comment here from Mike. He says, I primarily use ABC analysis for cycle counting. Do you have recommendations for annual counts for the A items, B items, and C items?
It's not really the world I'm from, the warehouse ABCs, but actually there are sort of best practices in that world, and there's ways of trying to take sort of statistical snapshots. So there's tools out there that that would actually use an ABC analysis as input. So you don't necessarily count all the 8 items every month, but you can say, okay, because it's an E item, we take a bigger snapshot and find the statistical difference in our inventory holdings. But no, I don't necessarily have a recommendation on what that interval should be. Question from Anthony. Once you completed an ABC analysis, any recommendation how often you will repeat the analysis? What would be trigger points to do the repeats? New customers on board or new vendors, contract established, new products. It could be very business specific. We typically go with about once a month. So once a month, also from a demand planning perspective, we just closed the last month, so there might be changes in the forecast algorithms. If you're going to do it on a weekly basis, you might look at a system that's too nervous because maybe you had a bad week and an item drops a class and then you lower the service level. So it might be too sensitive to very recent changes, and those changes might happen too often. But for a demand and inventory perspective monthly, warehousing, you're probably looking at a bigger interval.
Any more questions for Danny? I think that's all the questions we have so far. If you do have a question, feel free to type it in. Otherwise, you can get in touch with me via email, and I can send any questions for Danny following this webinar. So I don't see anything else here, Danny. As mentioned, we'll share this presentation, the recording, for anyone that needs it. There are a couple comments here as well in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to read out any of them or not, but
yeah, I see. I think someone is commenting on the ABC for warehouses. You could probably use some of your other criteria for ABC cycle counting. Stockouts, for example. I've never heard of an ABC on number of stockouts, but it's an interesting idea to use that in a cycle counting process. I see someone's working on or automation of the MRP parameters and ordering in our inventory. Yeah, I think ABC could be a very good tool to allow for automation in some, and not allowing automation for some of the more expensive products. I think that's really a good sort of goal that you're trying to set.
Okay, it looks like that's all the comments for now. Danny, thank you so much. Thanks again to you and to Slimstock for the webinar today. Lots of information in this great session. So again, if you need a recording or a copy of the presentation, just get in touch. Any last words, Danny, from you?
Well, you're welcome, of course. Was a pleasure. Thanks to Supply Chain Canada for helping us set this up. And yeah, if you have any more questions, we'll also include our contact details in the slide deck. So feel free to ask me any question anytime, or connect with me on LinkedIn if you have any follow-up questions.
Amazing. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Keep in touch.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.